The wind came low and steady through the broken pines, the kind that doesn't howl but hums like something old remembering. Snow had not yet begun to fall, but the air smelled of it, tasted of it, bitter, blue, and close. Down below, the land rolled out like a faded quilt. Dead fields, cracked ridgelines, a thin river glinting where the ice had not yet taken hold. On the highest ledge of that winter-bleached world rode two men. The first wore the uniform of a territorial marshal, iron star pinned hard above his heart, the kind of man who spoke with ownership in his voice and suspicion in his eyes. The second man was darker, broader across the shoulders, quiet as the horses beneath them. He wore no badge, just a weather-beaten coat, moccasins laced to the knee, and a beaded knife at his side that hadn't left its sheath in 3 winters. "Tasani," the marshal said, breaking the silence with a name that didn't belong in his mouth. "You know this part of the ridge?" Tasani didn't answer. His eyes scanned the far slope, past the stands of juniper, the charcoal ruins of a burned cabin, and finally, to the east where a lone chimney sent a whisper of smoke into the cold sky. "That's her place," Marshal Greevy said, tugging his reins to stop. His gelding pawed the frozen dirt, breath like fog in the air. Joseph Mayfield, 22, lives alone, gave bread and water to a wanted outlaw last month. We've reason to believe she's done it again. Tasani kept looking, but his jaw tightened. "She's not on any ledger," the marshal went on. "No husband, no kin, just a broken leg from polio and a reputation for being soft on trash. That's how these girls end up, thinking kindness'll buy 'em protection. She'll bring bad men straight into the hills." Still, Tasani said nothing. The marshal clicked his tongue, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled a folded scrap of brown paper. A crude sketch, smudged from rain, long hair, sharp cheekbones, one shoulder higher than the other. "Here," Greevy said, holding it out. "You know the way. Get it done quiet. One shot, no mess. Say she fell on the trail. I'll file the death myself." Tasani took the paper. He didn't look at the face, just folded it again and slid it into the front of his coat, near his ribs. "You'll have the full payment once it's done. That homestead's just a stone's throw from the old cliff trail. You could put her down clean, let the coyotes make it look like wolves." Tasani turned his horse without a word. The snow had begun in the high passes now, drifting like ash. He rode away. That night, the world grew smaller. Tasani crouched in the trees, just beyond the edge of the girl's clearing. Her cabin was smaller than he'd expected, crooked as a bent tooth, with light leaking through gaps in the shutters. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, and a low yellow warmth spilled onto the snow where a lantern burned inside. He could see her through the window. She moved slowly, limping from stove to table. Her hair was tied back, and her dress hung awkwardly off one shoulder where the fabric had been mended too many times. She paused often, resting her weight against the wall, as if her legs refused to forget the damage of years. She spoke to no one. She fed 2 birds that came each night, jays, bold things that waited near the sill for crumbs. She sat at a narrow table and read from a paper with careful hands. Then she pulled thread from a jar and began stitching what looked like a man's coat. There were patches on the cuffs that didn't match, buffalo hide stitched to linen, as if making something broken whole again. Tasani lowered his rifle. The air around him was still, heavy with cedar and snow. His people believed spirits moved more freely in the winter. They crossed more easily from the veil. And tonight he felt something standing behind him, old grief, maybe, or a memory given shape by cold and guilt. He had not spoken his wife's name in 2 years. He had loved her with the quiet desperation only warriors know, when the battle ends but the war never does. She had died in labor beneath a cottonwood tree. He'd ridden to the settler town for help. They'd shut their doors. "No doctor for savages," someone had said, without meeting his eyes. By the time he returned, she was gone. So was the child. And yet they called him savage. He rose from the snow, brushing pine needles from his coat, and began to circle the house. His boots made no sound. His rifle stayed across his back, untouched. He watched the girl a while longer, unnoticed, until the lantern inside flickered and went out. She slept with her hand tucked beneath her cheek, as if bracing against a blow that never came. Tasani retreated before the first frost claimed the trees. By dawn, the sky had turned pewter and cruel. Marshal Greevy was gone from the high ridge. Just as well. The man talked too much and listened too little. Tasani preferred silence. In silence there were fewer lies. He rode a long arc back to the ridgeline, higher now, where he could look down on the girl's land from above. The chimney smoke curled again. She'd made it through the night. He thought about what the marshal had said. No husband, no kin, just a broken girl in a broken house. Too kind, they claimed, too soft, as if mercy were a sin. The wind picked up, and with it came a light fall of snow, soft and slow, like feathers loosed from heaven. He opened the folded paper again and looked at the sketch for the first time. The face wasn't quite right. Sketches never were, but the eyes had something in them. Not fear, not fire, something else. Like someone who had watched the world forget her and decided not to beg for it back. He crumpled the paper and tucked it into a hollowed tree where snow would melt it come spring. The rifle stayed slung across his back. Below him, the girl stepped out onto her porch and scattered crumbs for the jays. One of them landed on her shoulder, and she smiled without teeth. Tasani watched her a long while. Then he turned, stepped into the shadow of the woods, and was gone before her eyes ever reached the trees. And the snow kept falling, gentle, steady, unjudging. The snow melted slow that week, in quiet patches, leaving veins of dark earth around the base of Joseph's fence posts. She noticed it on the second morning, how the ice pulled back just enough for one flower to show its stubborn head. A wild bloom, yellow and thin-stemmed, fighting its way up where even weeds had given in. Joseph knelt in her wool skirt and cupped the bloom like a secret. "Not your season," she whispered, as if embarrassed for it. But still, she fetched a ladle of water from the basin and poured a little at its roots. From the pines, far beyond her line of sight, Tasani watched her do it. He stood in the cold with one hand on the tree's bark, unsure what he was waiting for. The rifle across his back had grown heavier with each day he didn't use it. Greavy hadn't come back. No one had. And still, each sunrise, she limped from a house, watered that single, out-of-place flower, and went on with her life, like no one was watching. Joseph Mayfield didn't know who had mended her roof. The storm had broken part of it loose. She remembered that much. She'd gone to bed with the wind howling through the eaves and awoke to find the leak sealed with pine slats nailed down by a steady hand. No note, no boot prints, just a quiet kindness shaped like silence. She thought it might have been one of the birds or some passing angel with a carpenter's soul. Either way, she lit a candle in thanks that morning and hummed while she swept. The days folded into a kind of rhythm after that. She found jerky wrapped in cloth at the edge of her porch one day, then a bundle of dry matches tucked into the crack between boards the next. Once, a small flute carved from bone appeared on her windowsill. She picked it up, thumbed its notches, and held it to her lips, but didn't play. Not yet. Instead, she placed it on the shelf above her bed. She whispered, "Thank you," toward the woods. She wasn't used to being seen. Not since the fever took her mother and the neighbors stopped coming around. She'd been 17 then. Her leg had long since stiffened from childhood sickness, but her hands still worked, and her thoughts had always run deep. She'd loved a boy once, Isaac, from the dry goods store, but his father had laughed when she appeared at the barn dance in a lavender dress. "You'll never bear sons on that crooked leg," the old man spat, and the town laughed just enough for the pain to stick. Since then, she'd lived quiet. She planted herbs, boiled rainwater, kept a diary of poems no one would read. Her handwriting curled and looped like vines. Her life was orderly, small, and mostly forgotten, until someone began leaving her gifts. She didn't tell anyone. Not that there was anyone to tell. The townsfolk only visited when they needed something, milk, stitching, her vote on the winter schoolhouse decision. No one asked how she managed out here alone. But someone knew. Someone was watching with eyes that did not mock her limp or the way her jaw tensed when it snowed. Then one morning, just after dawn, she stepped outside and found a single object on her porch, a woven bag of jerky, tied with sinew, and beneath it, 3 tiny feathers bound in red thread. Her heart stopped. Apache. She stood motionless in the doorway, the wind lifting her hem, the bag still warm in her palm. She knew what the feathers meant. The settlers said all kinds of things, warnings, curses, tokens of death. But Joseph, being who she was, didn't believe in fear-mongering for men who drank more than they prayed. Still, she didn't move for a long time. When she finally brought the food inside, she did so gently, as though it might vanish if handled with anything less than grace. That night, she made stew with the meat and left a bowl on the edge of her steps. No words, no signs, just an offering returned. The wind howled that night, but she slept deeper than she had in months. Tasani didn't take the bowl. He left it untouched, but stayed longer than usual among the trees, staring at the firelight behind her window. He imagined her sleeping with a knife beneath her pillow, breath soft, heart steady. She hadn't run. She hadn't screamed or set the house ablaze in fear. She'd made him food. It unsettled him more than anything Greavy had said. He'd expected her to hide, to plead, to fight. But instead, she did something he hadn't been offered since before the sickness took his family. She trusted. Or at least, she didn't resist. Each time he saw her afterward, it was like a new thread being sewn through his chest. Not love, not yet. Just the hum of something half forgotten. The way she tilted her head to listen to birdsong, or the stubborn way she dragged water from the well despite her limp. She didn't ask for help. That mattered. She didn't beg for pity. That mattered more. In town, the talk had already started. Greavy had returned, jaw tight, muttering about incomplete reports and loose ends. Eli Bram had begun asking questions again, casual at first. Had anyone seen Joseph? Had she been out too much? Had she offered anyone shelter? Tasani heard the rumors from a half-drunk trader in the hills. Settler men feared what they didn't understand, and they often disguised that fear as righteousness. A girl living alone. Dangerous. A girl who might have seen too much. Disposable. He remembered Greavy's voice. One shot, no mess. And now he knew the girl's name not from a sketch, but from the way the birds responded to her presence. He began leaving different gifts, not for sustenance but protection. He tied a hawk feather above her gate. He carved a totem and buried it near her well. He built, in silence, a perimeter only she never noticed. Even the coyotes stopped coming near her livestock. One night, Joseph lit 2 candles instead of 1. She didn't know why. She simply felt, on some bone-deep level, that something was standing between her and harm. Not a man. Something older. Something wounded, maybe, but still standing. She began writing poems again. One every night. Some about winter. Some about longing. One about a man with hands like weathered stone and a silence full of meaning. She didn't use his name. She didn't know it. But she left the pages on her windowsill. Tasani read one in the dark and folded it into his coat. He didn't know why. He just did. The next morning, Joseph opened the window and found a ring of stones arranged beneath it. 12 of them in a perfect circle, and in the center, 1 bone-carved bead etched with a sun. She touched it, closed her eyes, and whispered a single word. Who? The wind didn't answer. But for the first time in many years, she didn't feel alone in the world. And somewhere not far off, the man who had been sent to end her life now guarded it with his own. The storm rolled in without warning, fast and bitter, clawing down from the high ridges like a thing betrayed. Its snapped branches rattled shutters and tore through the hollowed trees with a voice like old grief. Joseph was kneeling beside her hearth, feeding sticks to a faltering fire, when the door banged open behind her. At first, she thought it was the wind. But when she turned, he was there, tall, dark, soaked through from the snow. A shadow more than a man, framed by the howling dark and the flickering lamplight. He didn't speak. She didn't scream. The air between them held still, like the pause between lightning and the sound it makes. He stepped forward slow, steady, and closed the door behind him with a careful hand. The storm raged outside, but inside there was only quiet. Joseph stayed where she was, breath-catching, the poker still clutched in her hand. She knew who he was. Not his name. But she knew. You shouldn't be here, she said softly, more fact than protest. He glanced at the fire. Then at her hands, red from cold, too thin for the season. Neither should you, he answered, voice low, rough as thawed gravel. She rose, wincing as her bad leg protested, and gestured toward the chair near the hearth. Not a welcome. Not a surrender. Just a small act of grace. He didn't sit. Instead, he stepped past her, near the wall, and set something on the table. A rough-wrapped bundle of dry kindling. Then, without looking at her, he unslung the rifle from his back and laid it, deliberately, on the floor at his feet. Barrel pointed away. Hands open. That's when she exhaled. Outside, the storm grew worse. The shutters rattled like teeth. She moved slowly, careful not to startle him, and poured hot water from the kettle into the chipped tin cup she'd been using since girlhood. She added a sprig of dry mint from the cupboard. Then, wordless, she offered it across the space. Their hands touched only briefly. His fingers were calloused. warm despite the snow. He held the cup without thanks and drank without flinching at the bitterness. Joseph sat in her own chair, firelight brushing her cheekbones, and said nothing more. She'd learned long ago that silence can carry more meaning than all the words in a prayer book. He drank slowly, as if unfamiliar with the kindness. "You've been leaving things," she said at last, not accusing, not afraid. "I don't know why." He said nothing. She looked down at her lap, but it helped. He studied her a while. Her eyes, too old for her age. Her hands, worked raw but careful. She had the face of someone who'd lost more than she spoke of, but learned to survive in the losing. "Men came last week," she continued. "Asked about strangers. About shadows near the ridge." She paused, watching his expression. "I didn't mention you." His jaw tensed, but his shoulders didn't rise. "I didn't mention anyone," she added, voice gentler now. "People in this town, they don't see what they don't want to understand." Tasani set the empty cup down. "They want you gone." She nodded. "I know. They think you gave shelter." "I gave a coat," she said, "to a bleeding man who couldn't walk. Left him at the crossroads before dawn. He never even spoke. They don't care." "I know," she said again. The fire cracked between them. Tasani's eyes drifted to the shelves, lined with dried herbs, weathered books, a bone flute resting on a cotton cloth. Not trophies. Remnants of survival. He saw then the carving she'd made, a hawk, rough but recognizable, perched beside a worn Bible and a jar of feathers. She followed his gaze, then looked back to the flames. "I used to think I'd marry," she said, "before my legs stiffened, before folks got it in their head that I was better off ignored." Tasani said nothing, but in the pause that followed, something shifted. She reached beneath the chair and pulled out a sheet of paper, creased, handwritten, stained at the edge with something that looked like honey or oil. She held it out to him, not with pride, but with the soft reverence of someone offering a part of their soul. "I write things," she said, "when I don't know how else to feel them." He took it, glanced once, then slower the second time. The words weren't flowery, but they were full of ache. A man stood still like winter tree, and watched a house that would not flee. He bore a name she could not say, and yet he did not walk away. He folded the paper and slid it inside his coat, close to the place where he once kept a bullet for each man who'd wronged him. "You see too much," he murmured. Joseph's lips tilted, not quite a smile. "So do you." Outside, the wind screamed, and then fell suddenly still. Like it, too, had been holding its breath. He stood, picked up his rifle, and slung it across his back again. The moment was breaking. He could feel it. Moments like this never lasted. They weren't meant to. She rose too, slower, and held the door open. "You have a name?" she asked. He paused, looked at her. "Tasani." She tasted it once in her mind, then out loud. "Tasani." He nodded once, as if confirming something more sacred than identity. Then he stepped past her into the fading storm. She watched him vanish into the snow like smoke curling from a dying flame. When she shut the door, she did so gently, as if afraid to wake whatever hope had just begun to stir. And in the dark, she whispered the name again, not for memory, but for promise. The snow had barely melted when Joseph ventured back into town, limping along the frost-cracked path with a basket slung over her arm and her chin held high, like a woman trying not to flinch beneath 1,000 stares. And stare they did. Eyes followed her from behind lace curtains and general store windows. Mothers clutched their sons a little tighter. Ranch hands leaned slower on fence posts, their smirks less lazy and more sharp-edged. Joseph didn't return their looks. She'd long since learned the cost of acknowledgement. They took it as invitation, or guilt. She kept her eyes on the dry goods list she'd scratched in pencil. Flour, salt, a jar of liniment if she had enough coin. Simple needs. Survival needs. The bell above the shop door clanged when she entered. Inside, the warmth hit her like a trick, too sudden, too fake. A fire crackled in the back corner, and behind the counter stood Miss Tally, who looked up with pursed lips that had been waiting to judge. "Well," the shopkeeper said slowly, "you still among the living." Joseph forced a small nod. "Just need a few things." Miss Tally didn't move to help. "Storm last week tore half the ridge down. Figured you might have been carried off with the rest." "I wasn't." The silence stretched. Joseph set her basket on the counter and placed the list beside it. From the rear of the store, boots clicked against the plank floor. A shadow passed between shelves. Marshall Greevy emerged, His presence shifted the air, made it thicker. His coat was clean, his gloves black and stiff with cold. The iron star at his chest caught the firelight and threw it back like a blade. "Well, well," he said, eyeing her like a man inspecting livestock. "Joseph Mayfield. Just the soul I was hoping to run into." She didn't reply. "I hear you've been busy," he said, stepping closer. "Few townsfolk think they saw a shadow near your homestead. Tall figure. Not settler. Not local." "I don't keep company," Joseph said. Her voice was calm, steady, but her fingers curled around the edge of the counter. "No, you wouldn't. Not publicly, at least. But sometimes kindness is easier in the dark." Miss Tally cleared her throat, pretending to busy herself with jars. Greavy leaned in, voice low. "You ever hear of aiding a fugitive, Miss Mayfield? What the penalty is?" "I gave no aid," she said, "and I committed no crime." Greavy studied her. For a moment she saw it in his eyes, not justice, but hunger. The kind of man who liked seeing people squirm, especially the ones who stood alone. "Well," he said with a smile too thin to hold meaning, "let's hope you keep it that way." He turned and strode out, spurs clinking like punctuation. When the door swung shut behind him, Joseph let out a breath so slow it barely stirred her lungs. She collected her things without waiting for small talk. The shopkeeper offered no goodbye. Outside, the wind had risen again. As she made her way down the boardwalk, she saw Eli Bram standing near the smithy, arms crossed, chewing something with a leer. His eyes tracked her like a coyote, sniffing for weakness. He stepped forward without invitation. "Joseph," he said with mock warmth, "heard you've been getting visits." "I don't know what you heard," she said without stopping. He fell into step beside her. "I heard a war ghost's been lurking in your woods. Tall. Quiet. One of them. Heard he's been sniffing around your porch like a dog that caught a scent." She said nothing. "You always were soft," he went on. "Fed that runaway last fall. Lied to the deputies about where he went. Lot of folk know that now. You playing nursemaid to another outlaw." Her hand tightened on the basket. "I could help," Eli offered, tone slipping toward something colder. "All it takes is a yes. I know what you are, what you're not, and the town's got a short memory for girls who know how to be useful." She stopped, turned, and looked him squarely in the eye. "Go rot." His face twitched just slightly. Then, with a shrug, he stepped back. "Rot's better than what's coming for you, sweetheart. They already wrote your ending. You just haven't felt it yet." He walked away, whistling. By the time Joseph reached the edge of town, her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the basket. The sky had dimmed again. She looked over her shoulder once, then twice, then forced herself not to look anymore. The road back home felt longer. She didn't cry. She didn't have tears left for men like that. But as the pines grew denser and the town faded behind her, she felt something hot and foreign burning in her chest. Not fear, not yet. Rage. Cold, clear, and useless. Her foot gave way on the last hill. She stumbled, scraped her wrist, and cursed aloud. The words tasted wrong in her mouth. Bitter. When she finally reached the cabin, the wind was already lifting her porch rug and scattering birdseed across the steps. She knelt, gritting her teeth, and began picking up seeds one by one, her fingers numb and clumsy. That's when she saw it. A hawk feather, tied in thread, hung carefully on her doorframe. Not as warning, as signal. He'd been there. Joseph stood, turned, and looked into the trees, but saw only wind and shadow. Still, her heart calmed, just enough to steady her. She lit the lamps inside, bolted the door, and checked the window shutters twice. That night, she barely slept. Every howl of the wind felt like hooves. Every snap of ice like a rifle's cock. She dreamed of fires, of rope, of faceless men knocking down her door. She woke near dawn to smoke. Not from her hearth. She flung open the door and saw the glow before she smelled the pitch, her barn ablaze, flames licking upward into the early sky. She cried out, half limping toward it, grabbing a wool blanket and trying to smother the edges. But it was too far gone. The roof collapsed in a rush of embers. Her goats screamed inside. She sobbed, screamed, fought the fire with bare hands. Then, hands that weren't hers. A strong arm gripped the beam she couldn't lift. A voice she knew only from a storm said her name in a way that made it real. Tasani. He dragged the door open, kicked free a smoldering beam, and led two goats out through the back. One was limping, the other singed but alive. Joseph collapsed to her knees. He didn't speak. He just knelt beside her, pulled water from a trough, poured it over her arms, her hair, her scorched dress. His fingers were gentle but certain. When she could finally look up, she whispered, "They'll come back. They won't find you alone next time. I don't want to run." "Then we'll make them leave." She touched the edge of his coat. "Why are you helping me?" He looked at the flames dying behind them, then at her. "Because no one helped mine." In the fading firelight, the smoke curled like ghosts. And for the first time, Joseph wasn't cold. Dawn came with blood in its throat. A low red line burned across the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-glazed ridge where Joseph stood, wrapped in her patched shawl, her body still raw from the fire. Smoke rose behind her in thin gray threads from the blackened ribs of her barn. 2 goats pawed nervously at the earth, their breath sharp in the morning air. She did not move, not even when the first rider crested the hill. Marshal Greevy. He rode at the front, posture straight, face unreadable, flanked by 2 others, deputized ranchers from town, Eli Bram at their side with a grin thick as oil. Their horses stamped and blew steam into the brittle air, forming clouds that vanished as fast as they formed. Tasani stepped from the woods before they reached the fence line. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't need to. He just stood there, shoulders squared, feet planted in the frost-covered dirt like he'd grown from it. There was a silence in him that no lawman could break. Behind him, the trees loomed tall, sheltering. "Watching." "Well," Greevy said, reining his horse to a stop. "There you are." No one answered. "You didn't follow orders," he added, voice even. "You were given a name, a sketch, and a task. Instead, you played house with a traitor." "She's not a traitor," Tasani said, voice low and shaped like flint. Greevy chuckled. "You don't get to decide that. The law does." "I do." "She gave bread to a man who needed it," Tasani said. "The only crime here is that you wanted her gone." Eli Bram moved his horse closer. "And you're the one who should have done it. Guess I should thank you for failing, Savage. Now I get to clean it up myself." He reached for his sidearm. Tasani moved faster. One breath, then the sound of a shot cracking across the ridge. The pistol flew from Eli's hand before it ever cleared the holster, landing in the snow with a thud. Eli yelped and clutched his fingers, bleeding. Tasani didn't aim again. He didn't need to. "You'll draw again," he said, "and you won't leave this place." Joseph's breath caught, but she didn't speak. "Not yet." Greevy raised his hand slightly, glancing to his men. "Easy now. You're outnumbered. This doesn't need to end with blood." "No," Tasani said, stepping closer. "But it needs to end." He stopped just past the burned barn, between Joseph and the men who would silence her. His coat billowed slightly in the wind, the hawk feather tied to his belt rising with it. Greevy's eyes narrowed. "You siding with her over your own people now? Or just forgot which way the barrel points?" "I remember everything," Tasani said. "I remember how you let my wife bleed. How the town barred the doctor's door. How my child died in my arms while you lit your cigars and rode past like it was dust in the wind." Greevy didn't deny it. He only said, "That's not what this is about." Tasani's voice grew quieter, deeper. "It always was." He looked to Joseph. She hadn't moved from the porch, but she'd placed herself square in the open now. No shield, no bluff, just the straightness of a woman who knew she'd either be silenced or saved. And then, something unexpected, she stepped forward. Past the ruined fence, past the soot-stained soil, past Tasani's side, until she stood level with him. "Go on," she said to Greevy. "Do what you came to do." He hesitated. "Just long enough. I've never lied to this town. Never harmed anyone. I've lived quiet, worked hard, kept my head down. And you still call me dangerous." "You sheltered a wanted man," one of the deputies snapped. "I gave him a coat. He was dying," Joseph said. "If that makes me guilty, then hang me now and get it over with." She said it without tremble, without tears, just the stillness of someone who'd finally reached the end of being afraid. But it wasn't Greevy who moved. It was Eli. He surged forward, bleeding hands shaking as he reached for the knife at his belt. "She's lying. She's always been lying. You think she's innocent? She played you, just like she tried to play me." Tasani stepped between them, so fast Joseph barely saw it. A blur of motion, the butt of his rifle smashing into Eli's gut, dropping him to the snow in a gasp of pain. "Enough," Tasani growled. He looked to Greevy again, rifle now across his chest, finger loose, but ready. "You leave this ridge. You tell the town she's protected. and if they come again, they won't find her alone. The deputies looked at one another, unsure. And Greavy, for all his brass and badge, seemed to feel it at last, that this was no longer a woman on the edge of town. This was no longer a name to scratch off a list. This was a line drawn in frost and fire, and behind it stood something that would not kneel. He nodded once, almost too small to see. Then he turned his horse. The others followed, dragging Eli with them. Joseph watched them go, without a word. Only when they'd vanished over the hill did her shoulders sag. Tasani stepped to her side. "They won't be back." She looked up at him, voice barely a thread. "You can't know that." "No," he said, "but I'll be here if they do." She reached for his hand, not to be saved, but because for the first time she no longer had to stand alone. Weeks passed. The barn remained in ashes, but new beams leaned against the house. Tasani had begun rebuilding without being asked. Joseph limped less. Her face grew sunburned from working longer hours, and the deep circles beneath her eyes faded. He made her a bench. She carved a new hawk for it. And each evening, as the sky turned gold, they sat side by side without speaking. Sometimes he whittled. Sometimes she read aloud from her worn pages. And once, only once, she played the bone flute he'd left for her long ago. The song was rough, but it was beautiful. People still talked in town, of course. They always would. But no one came near the ridge again. Not after what happened that morning. Not after they saw what the so-called savage did for the girl no one wanted. Spring came late that year, but when it did, the yellow flower by the fence bloomed again. Joseph watered it with the same ladle, still limping, still standing, still hers. And Tasani, he came not as a ghost anymore, but as a man. One whose hands had learned to protect without being commanded. One who found, in the ruin of another, the kind of peace he'd thought the earth no longer held. They never spoke of love. They never needed to. But when their fingers touched at twilight, it was not a question. It was an answer. And the wind that once carried fire and ash now carried only birdsong and the soft scent of wildflowers. What the town called savage, she called salvation. And he called her home.